Hi, my name is Paul. I'm a Python developer. And today I would like to talk to you about clean code in tests. Some time ago, I was working on a new feature. And of course, I had to add a new test. And I discovered that adding a new test was not as easy as I wanted it to be. So after I was done with the feature, I decided to do some code refactoring in tests. And I discovered a lot of easy-to-fix mistakes that could have been avoided, but obviously they were not so obvious. So they were not so obvious when the tests were created. So I decided to put them together and show you how to fix them. But let's start with why. Why do you want to have clean code in tests in the first place? After all, tests are not production code. So no one is going to pay you for keeping them clean. Of course, you need to have tests, but once you have them, that's enough. Also, you write tests once, and then you don't modify them anymore, unless the requirements change. And you only read the tests when something breaks, and even then you usually read just the test message, not the test itself. Well, in my opinion, you still want to have clean code in tests, because tests are code, sorry for that, and hopefully they are the only untested code in your project. So you need to take care of it just like you take care of any other code in your project. Also, you need to write tests very often. For every new feature, for every bug fix, there is a new test, and you don't want to be discouraged to write new tests. You want this process to be very fast, very simple, so you can write a lot of tests easily. And you actually do need to read the tests because you read them every time something breaks. And that's very often while you are working on new features, you probably break the existing ones. And when the test message is not clear enough, then you have to read the test. And when you read the test and the test is not clear enough, then you waste a lot of time figuring out what it actually does. So that time is actually wasted, and you could use it more efficiently on implementing new features, so the fun stuff. So let's move to the examples. One of the most common mistakes that I found was using unclear names. In general, a name of the thing should tell you what the thing is or what it does. So let's have a look at this example. The test is called test transaction error. Let's say that this test fails. So I run the test in the command line. I can see this ugly red bar, and I can see a message, failed test transaction error, which tells me that there is an error in transaction, which tells me absolutely nothing, because I already know that there's an error because I can see the red bar and the failed message. So this message is, the message that I can see in the command line is not enough, so I have to dig into the test. I can see that this one creates some transaction data, attempts to create a transaction using that data, and checks that the process failed. So now I can rename the test into test creation transaction creation error. So now that it fails, I know that something went wrong with transaction creation process and not, let's say, updating the transaction or deleting the transaction, which is better, but it's still not enough. So let's say that I investigate further. I put a breakpoint after this response line, and I discovered that the response not only has a status code, but also a message. And the message says, you need to specify the amount. So obviously the organization data is not enough for a new transaction. We also need the amount data. And so I put another assertion into this test. And this is also a very common mistake that I have found, that the tests were just checking the status code and not the reason this status code was returned. So that way, when the reason changed, but the status code was still the same, the test was showing you that everything is okay, while in fact it wasn't. So now with these two assertions, I can the name of the test becomes clear. It's test cannot create transaction without amount. So now when this test fails, I don't have to read the test code itself. I just need the message because I immediately know that something went wrong with creation transaction process, and that thing is that now I can create transaction without the amount, and I shouldn't be able to. Next thing that I have found is using multiple assertions. In general, a test should do three things: create some data, perform an operation, and check the result. And so let's take a look at this example. I removed the empty lines because first, they would not fit on the slide, and second, I wanted to show you how unreadable those tests can actually be. So this test gets the list of transactions, checks that you cannot do that without being authenticated, then it logs in, gets the list of transactions again, checks that it is empty, then creates a transaction, gets the list of transactions again, and checks that there is one transaction on this list. So obviously we're looking at 3 different tests here, and we should split this one huge test into 3 smaller ones, each one with a meaningful name. So test transaction list requires authentication. That's great. Test transaction list is initially empty, and test new transactions are shown on list. Obviously, there is a downside to this approach. As you have noticed, the login as code needed to be duplicated in two tests, while in the original example, it was there only once. And this is a very simple example. In real life, you will probably need to duplicate a lot more code. But I still think it is worth it to split those huge tests into smaller ones, because now each of those small tests is easy to understand, is very clear. And when any of them fails, we immediately know what is wrong because each of them has a name suggesting what the test is actually doing. Let's compare it with test list transactions, which does everything. So when it fails, we just know that there is nothing wrong with listing transactions. Okay. Another thing is using complicated fixtures, and this is more of a matter of taste. In general, when you are reading a test, nothing should distract you from what the test is actually doing. So let's have a look at this example. The name is test cannot sell stock twice in one transaction, which is a meaningful name. The test creates one seller, creates 2 stocks with the same ID, some number of shares and comment, and then it attempts to sell those stocks and checks that the process failed, because you can't sell stock with the same ID twice in one transaction. This test is not bad, but it could be better. For example, we are using seller Frank Sinatra, age 33 here. Why is it Frank Sinatra? Is it important for the test? Well, in this case, it is not, because we are not testing the seller, we are testing the stocks. So we can use the default values provided by createSeller method, and that way we will end up with a seller that has probably a random name, second name, and age. But we don't really care about it because we are not testing the seller. We need the seller to sell the transaction, but we don't need any specific one. Also, both stocks have a number of shares specified and a comment. We are not testing those fields. We only need the stock ID, so we can remove these 2 arguments from calling the constructors. And also, why is it ID 35? Why not 37? This might also be a bit confusing, so we can just use the simplest ID possible. Assuming that our IDs start with 1, we can use 1. So this is how the test looks like after modifications. And now when you are reading it, nothing is actually distracting you from what the test does. It does not test the seller because we are using some default one. And it is not testing comments or number of shares. It is testing the stocks with the same ID. So next time you are reading this test, you will waste much less time on figuring out what is the important part and what isn't. Another thing is date-time manipulation. Sometimes in your tests, you need some object that is in the past or in the future. But sometimes it is not as easy as it might be. For example, here we want to check that the list of sellers for past transactions is correct. The problem is you cannot assign a seller to a past transaction, because once the transaction is in the past, it becomes frozen. You cannot modify it anymore. So we create a transaction, an upcoming one, which is the first line create transaction method. We assign a seller to it. We manually modify the date of the transaction to put it in the past. We save it. Then we create an upcoming transaction, add a seller. We call the API, and we check that the list of sellers for past transactions has only one item, and that one item, that one seller, has a past transaction associated with it. This time zone now minus time delta days 3 is very ugly, and this is, in my opinion at least, and this is a very simple example. I have seen examples that modified 5 dates for an object, or the worst example actually had a sleep 1 inside of it because it created something. It waited 1 second for that thing to become a past one, and then it proceeded with testing. And obviously having sleep 1 in tests is completely unacceptable. And the solution is very simple. We can use FreezeGun. It provides a very convenient context manager that allows you to freeze time at a specific date. So we can go to January the 1st, year 2000, create a past transaction, go to January the 1st, year 3000, create an upcoming one, and then go somewhere in the middle and get the list of past transactions and check that it contains the correct seller. So the list of sellers for past transactions, which is much more readable, and you can even simplify it further because we don't need the month or the day. We can just stick to the year, and this is the even simpler example that does not distract you with too much information. And using the context manager is much more readable than like subtracting one date from another. So these were the most common problems that I have found while on my test code refactoring adventure. I hope that this short presentation will help you in identifying similar issues with your tests and maybe it will help you fixing them. And that is all. Thank you for your attention. And are there any questions?
Hi. Can you show one of the slides with assertions? Okay, the slide where we can find response. So
the multiple assertions slide, this one?
Any slide with response. Assertion. Okay.
Yeah.
So let's say the line before the last one. So
yeah.
Yes.
This one, right?
Exactly. So in this case, I would suggest to print, actually to add response.content to the message, error message, because in this solution, if this assertion will fail without this extended message, you will not know why it failed. You will only see that status code is different from the expected one.
This is a good idea. I would just try to keep the examples very simple to show the point, or in this case, of splitting the large test into smaller ones. But of course, logging the response of the content of the response is a good idea. As you said, it shows why the test failed, not only that it failed.
So I would just keep it as a suggestion for clean tests, clean code, clean tests. So it would be.
Thank you very much. But still, even with logging the response content, I would still split this one huge test into smaller ones because it would be much easier to read them when something breaks.
Okay.
But thank you very much.
Any other? If not, thank you, Paweł, very much for your talk.